Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this ISM webinar on writing music for animation, video games and virtual reality. I'm François Evans, Associate Professor in Music at Middlesex University in London, and I'm accompanied here by a student of composition for screen at Middlesex, Ana Luisa Lima da Silva. Ana is from Brazil. In designing this presentation today, I'm aware that there's an awful lot to cover. This is a very new medium for composers such as ourselves to adapt to, and it's a world that's changing all the time. So if you'll forgive me, what I've done is I'm guilty of having put too much information on some of the slides, and I will be whizzing through rather fast so that we can finish on time within the next 50 minutes, 50 minutes or so, with a slot of time at the end for your questions, if you'd like to save those up as we go through. And if I'm not clear enough in any area, then I hope that Ana Luisa here will step in and ask for clarification towards the end, if that's all right. So let's get cracking. Lots of questions came in through the ISM about this field, and I picked on the key areas of each question. What brief does a composer get? Which comes first, the music or the image? What are the responsibilities of the composer? And then how do you approach composing slotted music for these types of media which are quite time-based and depend on the action of a player or a participant who's walking around in a virtual world? How much time do we get to prepare this material? And then how do we ensure that we make this work sustainable through contracts to ensure that we get paid for the work that we do? How does that work? And does it change when we're working to present music in virtual environments? And then how do you get a job in the industry? How does that work? The structure of the presentation today then is based around those questions, the brief to aspects of employment. And towards the end, you'll see that there are slides that you can peruse, which have a list of books that I've found very useful to explain things, and lots of websites and online fora that you can join to find out more about this new world. There's a lovely quote from George Lucas, whom we all know as the man behind the Star Wars series of films. He says, "I feel that sound is half the experience. Filmmakers should focus on making sure the soundtracks are really the best they can possibly be, because in terms of an investment, sound is where you get the most bang for your buck. And people are often unaware of the extent to which sound quality affects impression. Next time you go to the cinema, try to focus on the sound effects and the sound atmospheres that you're hearing. Very often you'll notice that they seem a little bit hyper-real. And that's probably because they've been added on afterwards and they're not real. So a lot of processing gets put in to the way in which sound worlds for film are designed." So the first area, the brief. What kind of brief does a composer get? Well, in looking around this area, be aware that the director and producer of the production can sometimes disagree with each other. The director deals with guiding the participants who are making the film. The producer generally deals with the financial side of things to watch money flow as the production is made. But they're both obviously important people. Some directors that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past can be quite insistent, and that can be a good thing because you've got somebody to guide you, while others will give you a carte blanche to do whatever you like, and that frees the composer up. So just be aware of how the director and producer like to work and be ready to adapt to that. Some directors and producers know a little or a lot about music, and some don't seem to know very much about music as we do. And if we've been through a lot of training ourselves, sometimes we can take that training for granted. and not perhaps appreciate that others don't always understand what we mean when we talk about tritones and octaves and false relations in harmony and that sort of thing. So it's a good idea generally not to talk about music when you're liaising with directors and producers, and talk more about emotions and encourage them to talk about what sort of feeling they would like an audience to feel in particular situations. As part of the brief, you'll be asked to compose, to arrange, to record, and mix the music. How much you want to get involved yourself in each of those areas is up to you and up to your skill set. You then, at the end, deliver things called finished mixed masters in a usable format. More about that later. The format that's used at the moment for exchanging music projects is the music XML file, which you can consider to be a little bit like a washing line, which is a timeline, with cues of music pegged onto it at intervals where the music is supposed to start very accurately. Generally, you'll have a spotting session, as many of you will know. Those of you who've worked in film, in sort of a time-based film where the timeline is fixed for writing music, you'll have a spotting session where you agree, usually with the director, also maybe with the editor, where the music's going to go, where it will start, where it will stop, and what character that music will have. Sometimes there's a problem that you get a rough cut from the director, and that can make it difficult for composers to time the music. So you need to be prepared to be quite flexible later down the line if the work is going to be re-edited, because then you might need to adjust your music to fit. And if you're very happy with the finished result, that can be frustrating. So be prepared to adapt. It's really nice to have a locked edit so that you're not having to rework music all the time. But as I say, you have to be prepared to do that, as many of you will know. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this next section, which is about the basics of timing music to picture, because I don't feel that's really what this webinar is about centrally. But as you may know, the length of one beat is 60 seconds divided by the metronome mark. And that's the formula, the principle by which music is timed to picture. Quantize carefully for acoustic instruments at the computer, because if you are working with a digital audio workstation to generate parts for players, as you may know, you have to quantize so that the music appears correctly in scored parts for those players of acoustic instruments. A teacher of mine many years ago, an amazing composer by the name of Wilfred Josephs, once told me that we'd need a minimum accuracy of 1/3 of a second when timing music to picture. Working to 1/3 of a second now, I feel that's quite loose compared with the kinds of accuracy that we're expected to work to nowadays. So try to work to frame accuracy if you can, which is about 1/25 of a second. From this formula, you can generate bar breakdowns. Bar breakdowns look like this, where you know where particular rhythmic points in your bar are going to lock to events in the picture. I'm going to move on. Oh, quick word of warning. Don't make the mistake I did in one of my first feature film scores with compound time signatures. Remember that there's a difference between a dotted crotchet and a crotchet when you're counting metronome marks. If you put crotchet equals what have you, and you're working in a compound time, that can cause problems with synchronization later on. It's a sort of mistake you only ever make once. Right, what are your responsibilities as a composer? Well, there are the schedule, originality, appropriateness, and the payment schedule to think about. In terms of the schedule, you've got to come up with the music on time when they want it, and perhaps factor in time to do some rewriting if they're not quite happy with the music. It's a good idea, I think, to write about 5 minutes of music first, share that with the director and producer, make sure they're happy with the direction that you're going in before you start composing any more music. And that can save a lot of problems and heartaches later down the line. Your music has to be original. Don't copy. Don't use samples from other people's music. Make your own. It's much more fun and then you're not going to run, obviously, into copyright problems and issues later down the line. Your music has to be appropriate and to fit in with the moving image. The aesthetic has to be right, has to be well timed to picture, and it has to be of an appropriate quality. Different producers and directors have different notions of what quality constitutes. The payment schedule, which can be divided, which can involve, payments divided into half, a third, or a quarter, so that the composer gets paid in stages as they work through the production, matches up with aspects of responsibility. So you'll know that you're doing okay if you keep getting paid. The payment schedule, if it's divided into 4, might work in such a way that you're being paid a quarter up front on starting work, a quarter perhaps at what I call the Polaroid party, when you present that first 5 minutes of music, perhaps a quarter at the recording session with acoustic musicians, and then the final quarter on presentation of finished mixed master recordings. Now, here we get to the heart of the matter, where we have to learn now as composers to adapt to this new medium of music for virtual reality and computer games. And this is, as I say, the central focus here. There's a nice little quote from Martin Dufour, who says, who talks about the interactive audio renaissance, bringing sound back to life after a century of baking it to film. What he means by baking sound to film is that sound used to be printed as an audio image onto celluloid film that a photocell would then read and send through amplified to loudspeakers. But now we have to start thinking in new ways. To adapt to the medium, there are several things to consider. Picture as inspiration, sound and music enhancing the image, aspects of timing and creative flow, the kinds of virtual environment, the world of diegetic and non-diegetic sound with which some of you will be familiar, and other aspects of interactive music. So let's go through these in turn. Picture as inspiration. Yes, I don't know about you, but I get very inspired when I see pictures, and it gives me ideas for things to do in music, and I'm sure you feel the same. Many composers who are attracted to the medium of writing music for film feel they need to have these visual stimuli to inspire them, and that can be a good thing. Sound and music really have a very powerful effect on moving image, sometimes more than you might think. If you turn down the sound next time you're watching a film that has music playing, you might be surprised as to how much effect that music is having on the way in which you interpret the picture. Timings can inspire composers when you're adapting to the medium, but let's imagine you were writing music for a particular cue, and you suddenly find that you're on a roll and you've got this gorgeous piece of music going along, and you just can't stop as a composer. You want to keep going and write the next section of music and maybe another movement, and this thing spreads on, but the scene has long since finished. What should you do in those circumstances? My advice would be keep going, keep composing, let the flow go, and then perhaps use that extra music in a later scene if you want to, or perhaps even a later production if it will fit and work thematically. But very often I've found that if I'm composing music for a cue and a scene ends, quite often I have to finish the music perhaps a little bit abruptly when your instinct takes you on a musical flow. I hope that makes sense. Then this section's really important. What are the different kinds of virtual environment? In the literature that's coming through at the moment on the different kinds of virtual environment which are emerging, there are 3 separate and distinct areas. There's virtual reality, which completely replaces the user's world. You step into it and you are not in touch with real reality anymore. Then there's mixed reality, where virtual worlds and real worlds get mixed together. Some of us have seen films where you have cartoon characters interacting with real people. That could be an example of a mixed reality in a sense, although a mixed reality is something that would involve your world more directly. You step into it and you experience it with these aspects of virtual worlds, if you like, interfering with reality. And the third kind is alternate reality, where it's a little bit more subtle. You have virtual objects inserted into the real world. I saw a feature film recently in which a fellow is walking down a pavement and he sees other people, and as he sees them, information about those people pops up above each person's head. So it's a bit like being able to find out more about a person without having to ask them. That information just appears there through alternate reality. Much research is going on at the moment, certainly at the university where I work, into aspects of haptics and ambisonics in virtual environments. Haptic is a big word like marmalade, but it just means aspects of touch. So interfaces are being built at the moment where your sense of touch, the receptors on your skin are being interacted with, so that you can actually feel physically these virtual worlds. You can feel things brushing past you, for example. Ambisonics differ from the way in which sound is treated nowadays, in the sense that we are used perhaps in concert halls and in the way that we listen to sound at the moment to stereo sound, and maybe even quadraphonic or even 5.1 surround sound. But all of these tend to work either in one dimension for stereo sound, left to right, which is a line, 2 dimensions for quadraphonic, and 5.1 sound, where you have sound in front of you and sound behind you, but that environment is still rather flat. Ambisonics differs in that here we're dealing with 360-degree sound, or sound, if you like, that occupies a sphere around you. So it's possible to have sounds moving in space and coming from behind you, above, below you, in any direction, really. Already there's been a lot of research in ambisonics, particularly in military research, where, for example, pilots of fighter craft need very quick systems to respond to tell them perhaps where an enemy is. And ambisonics can be used to send alarms so that the pilot automatically looks at where they need to know where a sound source is, and they can interact with it as they might need to. So let's move on. Diegetic and non-diegetic sound then is next. And here, if you don't know, I guess you probably do, diegetic sound, this is a word that was coined by Claudia Gorbman, a researcher in the United States who's done a lot of work into describing how sound works with image. Diegetic sound is sound that characters can hear, characters in the artificial world, if you like. Non-diegetic sound is sound that the characters in the artificial world cannot hear. So, for example, if you watch the film Star Wars, non-diegetic sound would include the sound of the London Symphony Orchestra playing John Williams' score. You don't expect a cellist to be from the LSO to be floating around outside in space looking into the Millennium Falcon. But as we contemplate the differences between diegetic and non-diegetic sound in virtual worlds, we find that new syncretic music languages are evolving. I'm sure that you've seen many film scores now in which real-world sounds are transformed slightly, but they're transformed in such a way that they don't become recognizable so much anymore. And when that happens, one could say it's leaning over into the world of music making, not necessarily in terms of diatonic music, so music that's in a major or a minor key, or that's using functional harmony, but more what they call spectromorphological sound, where you're using color changes or timbral changes in sound to make effective music. And it's possible, of course, to communicate emotionally using such techniques. So these are all worlds which are really down to you, up to you, the composer, to handle and to invent new musical languages with. And it's a really exciting area where I don't have the answers, but I think we only find those answers through experimentation and through playing and seeing what works while we're working with picture. Moving on. Interactive music is a really a tough change to adapt to, in that your music and how it's triggered and what happens when, the form of your composition, is going to be controlled not so much by you anymore, but by the player and by what the player does, what the characters interacting in the virtual environment are doing. If they change room, then one kind of music may have to change at a time when you might not want it to change. Well, that's just the way it goes. So music responds to the player input during gameplay, and you have to make music interactive. How does this happen nowadays? It's a changing field, but let's take a look at how it works right now. To make music interactive. As Mark Kilborn says, who made Call of Duty, the game, he says implementation is half of the creative process. So there are 10 ways of making music interactive at the moment today, and from my point of view, they seem quite crude at the moment, and I'm certain that in the future these aspects are going to become much more complex and sophisticated in really interesting ways. Let's have a look at how they work at the moment. The first one then is looping. Now, I've got a little confession to make to you at the moment. In my 26 years of teaching students, one of my bugbears is the loop, because as we all know, if the human ear hears the same thing again and again, if the human ear hears the same thing again and again, if the human ear hears the same thing again and again, we tend to get rather bored rather quickly and can get quite frustrating. So I'm encouraging my students all the time not to make loops that are the same all the time, but to vary their loops. We love variation. Mother Nature never repeats herself. Look at the leaves on a tree. They're similar to each other. But if you have a look at two of those leaves, there'll always be subtle differences between them. And that's what our minds are always focusing on, and what we're always looking out for is that balance between similarity and difference. So I'm always wary of loops, but loops are needed to make music interactive, because they're what enable the composer to make music that can get longer or shorter depending on how a participant acts inside the game or the environment. Stems. I used to be terrified of the notion of stems because I just thought it was a way of cutting up music and not allowing a composer to decide the structure of a piece of music. But stems are part and parcel of making music for computer games and what have you. So let's move on and look at that in a bit more detail. So aspects of stems. What is a stem? A stem is a section of music that can layer with other sections of music at the same time. A stem will loop. So if you have one loop going on of your music, you can compose another loop that goes along with that, and it must fit with it contrapuntally. And you might have 4 or 5 of these loops going on at the same time. Those stems then can layer before you move to a next section of music, which might involve a different set of stems that are designed to work together. So we can see that studying harmony and counterpoint is essential to being able to make stems that are going to work and fit together well. Think about Mozart's musical games. I think one of his serenades uses rather clever mathematical patterns to make its counterpoints fit. And you'll be aware of such pieces as J.S. Bach's musical Offering, where there are all sorts of contrapuntal games going on. Bach, I think, would have enjoyed making stems and music for computer games. He'd have enjoyed that. Conjecture, anyway. Stems can fade in or out, and game rules will dictate how those fade in or out. How you use instrumentation in each of your stems is important. Let's imagine that you have, say, a chamber orchestra playing your music. If you've got one stem that uses, let's say, all of the woodwind, and then you have another stem that uses more woodwind, if you think about it, when those two stems play together, you'll be doubling up your woodwind and having more players sounding than you actually have in your preconceived ensemble. Therefore, you have to be aware not to double up instruments between stems when you're composing. You have to be aware of what the fixed instrumental resource is as you're putting these elements together. Layers can be muted at different times. Layers can work by instrumental family. Orchestration is more complex than this, as we know. Sometimes, for example, I bet that one thing you may like to do when you're orchestrating is to add, for example, a harp harmonic to, say, a clarinet line, just to give a gentle ringing attack to a sound. But if later on you have a harp melody playing, you can't use that harp harmonic at the same time on a note, because that might not be physically possible for a harp player. These are things that we as composers need to be sensitive to as we're building stems. The way you use stems is limited only by your own imagination, but sections need to be of the same length, the same key, and the same tempo. One has to think about that and be aware of that when switching between sets of stems. If you change key, are you going to get a modulation that's going to sound good, depending on what one of the characters in the virtual environment does? I hope that makes sense. Tempi can also change. If you have a fast section or a slow section, is it going to work musically if you suddenly switch to a different tempo? I've seen quite a few computer games where it's quite jutty, the way in which switches from one piece of music to another piece of music go. And we really need to think about all the possible combinations and permutations of possible form that can be generated by these musical mobiles that we are making. It's important to order stems by intensity. What I mean by that is that games will have different levels, which I'll come to in a moment to explain that. But that as a player, for example, advances through a game and gets closer to an endpoint or a treasure or a point of accumulation, the music may need to sound more intense for each of those sections, and that's something that needs to be pre-composed in. You would liaise with the makers of the game to decide what kinds of intensity of music are needed. And if you're building stems for this, then it may be that just a single stem has to sound quite intense on its own anyway before other stems are added without things becoming too overloaded. I'll come along to levels and characters. So game levels here are important for the reasons I've already explained. And game characters are important. I'm sure you've heard many people, and perhaps even yourselves, if you enjoy playing computer games, referring to characters having particular musical themes. People love that when you have a leitmotif or a particular melody associated with a particular character, and that can help us to structure the music. It's a good idea to use. You might want to think about the contrapuntal melodic relationships between those themes as you're writing for different characters, depending on which characters interact with each other and how and when and where in the game. Continuity is important. Consider the timing effects of anacruses, for example. If you've got some stems looping and you have an upbeat or an upbeat note in your loop, that anacrusis is going to loop, isn't it? If it's part of that loop. And if it's not, you're going to have to find a way of programming that so that the upbeat note to a next section doesn't get looped if you don't want it to be. So it's just an aspect that that one needs to be aware of. Starts are important as well, I think. When you are relying on loops for music for virtual environments, if a player is beginning in a particular scene, they might find they have to engage with repetitive actions where you're always going to hear the beginning bit of your music again and again until they actually get to the next stage of the game. And if that's the case, you might want to pre-build in what I call shelf life into your music. This means designing music where it doesn't matter if you hear it 100 times, it still sounds interesting. We all have in our music collections pieces of music that we enjoy listening to again and again, and that we don't throw away, that we don't tire of. It's worth asking yourself what it is about those pieces of music that make you keep going back to them and that stop you getting bored with them. If you can find out what that is, what those key aspects are, and here's a tip for you: in successful minimalist music by composers such as Steve Reich, for example, and John Adams, they're very good at designing music that is good for repeating. So think about longevity of what you write and build that into the beginnings of sections, because those are the parts that are going to get repeated. There are traditions being formed at the moment, new traditions, aspects of musical style, as composers begin to work in these more mobile form ways of working in virtual environments. To an extent, the game arranges the music rather than the composer. So we really have to think in 3 dimensions in terms of space and time. Then there's aspects of repertoire to be aware of. It's worth studying music so that you can learn the principles of music from different times. Imagine that a game or a virtual environment is going to take you back to Renaissance times. Are you able to write music in the style of Palestrina, for example, in the style of 17th century composers? Quite often we're seeing history, meddled with nowadays, as composers don't respect those older musical styles, and we might hear something that is anachronistic. Clever composers such as, I don't know if you've heard music by George Fenton, for example, in the marvelous film Dangerous Liaisons. George Fenton is very clever at writing music that sounds right stylistically for an 18th century era, but he's got ways of tweaking the way, tweaking the style of the music, so that it still so that it has its emotional effect, but it still works in correctly in the time that the film or that the environment is set in. So I think that composers have to learn how to write in different musical styles depending on where the game or the environment is situated and when the environment is situated. Game engines I want to talk about in more detail because these are really important. And then we'll come back to talk about aspects of liaising. Right. In the work of Stefan Schutz and Erwin Schutz, they wrote a book which is in the bibliography that accompanies this presentation. They say audio programming environments such as Max MSP and Super Collider offer the necessary programmability but are not oriented for productivity at the scale of game asset production. This is how game audio middleware was born. Now, what does all that mean? Well, those of you who are familiar with Max MSP as what's called quite a high-level programming environment will know that these are tools that composers can use very flexibly to build mobile triggering environments for compositions. The trouble is that these softwares, although they're really useful and cleverly designed and open-ended, they're not always geared for working with the kinds of software that computer game makers use at the moment, and that those building virtual environments, other virtual environments use at the moment. Now, technology has the nasty habit of going out of date and becoming obsolete very quickly. So if you're watching this presentation again long after it was originally broadcast in February 2020, then the following may be out of date, but I can only be where I am. So here we go. Game engines, let's have a look. The game engines that computer game makers use at the moment are either Blender, Fmod, Unity, or the Unreal Engine. And I know that these are going to change in the future. It's inevitable. Composers don't tend to work directly with these. composers will work with digital audio workstations. And the good news is that that's fine. We can keep doing that using such DAWs, as they call them, as Mark of the Unicorn's Digital Performer, Apple's Logic Pro X, Nuendo, Cubase, or Ableton Live, if you use those. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with those. A quick little word for you. I'm really surprised that a lot of composers nowadays use notation software to compose with, such as Sibelius and Finale, and the new softwares that are coming out from Steinberg for notation at the moment. One of the problems with that is that if you make your score look gorgeous and you align your dynamics and your hairpins well, later if you decide to transpose sections of your work, that means that you've got to realign all those little expression marks in your score, and that can take an awful lot of time. So my advice is work inside a digital audio workstation until you're completely happy with your composition, and then export that MIDI information into a notation program and do your notation and scoring only once. That's a quote from George Lucas, by the way. Do things only once. It's a great tenet. Now we have middleware appearing. These are software spatial audio engines, such as OpenAL or WY's spatial audio is very popular. Now, what do these do? These are pieces of software that sit between the game engines and the digital audio workstations. The idea is that you export your stems, which I described before, from your digital audio workstation, and you set them into your middleware software. And what the middleware does is it will allow you to define what the circumstances are under which certain of your stems get triggered. So for example, you might want to say, if this object in the game gets touched, then that must trigger this sound effect, this sting, this sound atmosphere, or this particular looping musical stem. Then when that middleware knows that, it will pass that on to the game engine as it transfers that that added to musical file across in this way. So you see the arrow going across from DAWs to game engines there. The other aspect that middleware handles is spatialization in the way I described before in terms of ambisonics or 360-degree sound. So all the aspects of positioning of your music, whether it's going to be stereo in front, low down, or higher up. Maybe you have a sound design that you've made that's associated perhaps with a flying craft that's coming towards you in the game, and you want to change reverberation settings that are associated with that sound, depending on how far away that object is from you or how close it is to you. So you can hear the difference there as I move closer or further away from the microphone. That can all be programmed into your middleware, which is very useful before it gets ported into the game engine, which the game makers will be using to make the game. Okay, generally though, the composers who are making stems for the makers of virtual environments, computer games, and so on, generally composers stick to their digital audio workstations, and you might find that those who are making the games themselves might be working with middleware and using that. And so they can step in, you can work together and liaise with them, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that things get programmed properly so that your music is triggered as it needs to be and in the way in which you conceptualize. I hope you're beginning to see now that there's a lot more to composing for the composer nowadays. We have to deal with aspects of spatialization. We have to know when things are going to be triggered and how, and whether it's worth saving something up. For example, if you have a climax built into your music and you don't want that to happen too often, then you would need to make it very clear to the game makers that that has to be kept in reserve and not appearing too much in the game for the game to be appreciated more by the player. Aspects of pacing and regulation, if you like, of the musical material. All right, liaising then with the game makers is really important to determine when and how sound comes in. Think about fade-ins and fade-outs as well, which is controlled by the middleware. All right, the process here. Now, in this section, I realized that how you compose for animation, video games, and virtual reality, it's a really complex process and probably beyond the limits and the time that we have to really engage with the aspects of composing for computer games and virtual realities that are relevant to this presentation. Many composers think that the only thing that you need to do is to compose the score and then job done. Well, not. Actually, these are the steps that are involved. You get the gig, you have to sort out the contract, you've got the spotting session, which I described earlier. You compose and harmonize your themes, I would say away from the picture. You build your instrumentation, you book your recording studio if you want to. Maybe you're going to record at home. There are plenty of examples of that happening now. You hire your players if you're going to use them. Then you compose the score. You pre-plan any stems in the ways that I've begun to describe earlier. You have your Polaroid party. Polaroid because the old Polaroid pictures were a sort of rough sketch of what something looks like. It gives you a rough and ready picture of about 5 minutes of music. You record your electronic backings. You make your master score and parts. Print those out. You record your acoustic parts from the mechanical instruments such as a cello or a clarinet in the recording studio. You edit the best takes. You mix your acoustics and your electronics. You check your stem loops that they're working well. Ooh, a little tip for you about that. And that's that if you've got a stem looping and it sort of stops about 3/4 of the way through, and then you get you get a reverb tail at the end. If you're looping that and you don't get the reverb you don't hear the reverb when the loop doubles back on itself, that can give you a sort of what I call a swallowing effect as the loop happens, because the reverb that you're expecting will continue at the end of the loop as you hear the beginning of the loop actually stops because it wasn't there when you first recorded that loop. So what you need to do is to record the reverberation after that loop and then mix that bit of reverberation that happens after the loop in with the beginning of the loop itself. If you do that, you won't get the swallowing effect, and the reverberation inside the loop will sound much more natural. It's a good trick to be aware of. You then export your stems, including metadata, which I'll talk about later, and then deliver your finished mix masters, notify PRS for your performing rights, and PPL UK, that's if you are working in the United Kingdom. As a composer, PPL UK to ensure you get your performing rights and that the players who have recorded on your score get their performing royalties as well, to make sure that everybody's happy. So there's a lot for the composer to do. Right, we've got about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to talk about schedules and employment. The employment section I'm going to super whiz through. They're slides that have got a lot of information on. I probably won't give you time to read the whole slide, so if you download or view this presentation afterwards, you'll be able to pause your video and read those. And there's lots of information in the resources section that will be published afterwards for you to read around the following sections. So here we go then with schedules. How much time do you get? And how fast, ouch, ouch, do you need to be able to compose? And will that compromise your creation? Well, schedules, 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 plan, 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 have a diary. You need to know how many minutes of music there are for you to compose. You divide that by the time that you've got to write your music in to find out how much music needs to be written per day. I remember hearing from the fabulous American, the late American film composer Jerry Goldsmith once. He said that he could write about 2.5 minutes of music per day. If I'm writing music for orchestra, that's about how much I can write. Although If you're writing fast music, action sequences, there are more notes because the tempo is higher, and that can mean that you end up writing less than about 2.5 minutes per day. But if you're writing slow, romantic music, then you will find that you might end up writing up to 3 minutes per day. So that's something to think about and factor in when you're planning ahead how much music you can get written in time, so that you so that you work in accordance with the contract which you had agreed with the production company at the start of work. Know how fast you can work. Know thyself. Factor in time for setting up. It's not just about composing, but as those of you who have made electronic or electroacoustic music will know, it takes a lot of time to get your samples together, to get your libraries of instruments built up, to make choices between different sample libraries if you're using those, to program synthesizers, because I know none of you use presets, because you all like to have your original sound so that you have your own sound and you're not sounding like every other composer who uses presets. I'm being cheeky, but also a bit serious. It's a great idea to make your sound world your own, because then you will stand out as a composer. It's important to sort cues of music that you're going to write into styles. What I find when I'm writing music for films is that if I get up in the morning and I'm feeling particularly romantic, then I'm more likely to want to write music for a love scene. Or if I'm feeling particularly energetic, then I might want to do an action cue. Or if I'm totally tired, then I might want to write something that's very slow. So it's nice to build into your schedule some flexibility into your diary, so that you can write according to how you feel. Inevitably, there'll be days when you've just got to write that fast action cue, even if you don't feel like it. The brain is a wonderful thing, and if you just start and put in that activation energy, you'll find that you suddenly get into the work, and you can steer yourself. For more on that, there's a fabulous book. Get the 1960s edition. It's called Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, but that's not relevant to the current presentation, so I shall move on. Map out your schedule for composition, for production, and also factor in time for your copyist and printing out your parts. All right, contracts. Now, this is an area where the Incorporated Society of Musicians is really helpful. They have a fabulous legal team, and I'm aware that there are templates out there for contracts which you can use. So I'm not going to go into too much depth here, other than to say it's a really important part, and get that all sorted out before you start composing for a production company there. You'll find that deals can be package or fee-based. In a package deal, all the money comes up front for dealing with all aspects of the production of music. In higher budget productions, they're based on a fee-based deal structure, where the composer is paid just to write music, to compose the music, and things like money for studio bookings and players and copyists and so on are handled by the production company. It's very important that you assign the synchronization license when you're dealing with music for picture. This is not a license which applies to music for concert hall, unless the music is going to be videoed for live broadcast elsewhere. But as your initial intellectual property, you will, as composer, have to assign and give them the right to synchronize the music to picture. More information on that is available through the ISM or through the Association of Independent Music. All right, here's a slide for you to read through with aspects of contracts to be aware of, and I'll leave you to press pause on that after this video presentation becomes available online. Ancillary markets. To survive as a composer, it's important to consider how else your music can be composed other than being used just in your production for music and for virtual reality and computer games. So think about the metadata that's in there that identifies the music as being yours, because digital files have a habit of flying around very freely. Information wants to be free, as Karl Bartos of Kraftwerk once said, and he's right. So protect your music with appropriate metadata so that it can be identified as being your intellectual property as appropriate. Consider aspects of reuse and new use. And think of the different ways in which your music can be used for other productions afterwards. To get work, then think about your skill sets. You might say, well, I only compose and I don't really want to get involved with aspects of software or digital sound processing or so on. That's fine. In which case, get other people to work with you, a team of people who are specialists in other areas. Look at freelance websites are out there to get work, but I find that they're not always terribly useful because there's so much competition for the little one-off jobs that appear there. And it's much better to liaise, make friends with people who are working in the industry and to build those contacts over time to network and get work in that way. Outlets there, television, film, corporate communications, training videos. And again, remember that the industry comprises wheels within wheels. I have never got film music work directly from a production company. It's always been by somebody talking to somebody else who then recommends somebody else to somebody else who then ends up calling you. So it's never direct. It's always through relationships that work comes to people. That's been my experience anyway. Niche yourself when you're self-marketing so that you are really being as individual as you can as a composer. Demos should really be geared to the production you're applying for. Get yourself a website set up to share your musical material. Be a buzz on the scene. Listen to people and what they're saying. Ask questions to find out what's going on rather than asking for work. And take an interest in other people. You're much more likely to get work that way. What goes round comes round. I'm going to move on because I'm aware that time is fleeting. These slides are all described in more depth in the materials which accompany this presentation. So I'm going to whiz on so that we have some time for questions, because I'm sure that you must have some to ask at the moment. If you have any questions from the slides that are being shown at the moment, then please don't hesitate to email me. My email address is coming up afterwards. But I think we should move on to questions now. There's a couple more topics there to do with employment. Skill sets, gosh, that people keep advising us to acquire more and more skills. I think there's nothing wrong with specializing and being able to rely on a group of people so that we can work together and associate with each other much more. Life is a social thing. We should preserve that in this age where we tend to communicate through technological devices more and more. Okay, so la fin, the end there. I think I'll stop and we can turn to questions if anyone has any. I hope this session has been useful to you. As I say, if you have other questions to ask afterwards, then do email me if you'd like to. My email address is at the bottom right of the screen there. Shall I answer that question now? I think it might be worth it. Okay. We've had a message from one participant here who said, sorry to interrupt, is there any chance we can see the actual presentation instead of the presenter's screen? Apologies about that. These slides will be available on the internet in full size afterwards. Apologies for font sizes. I appreciate that anything smaller than 16 point is difficult to read. But yes, those slides will all be available online afterwards. So don't worry, they'll be there.
I do have a question.
This is Anna. Anna stepping in.
It was all very interesting and very clear, but I think one of the things that I always kind of struggle with is the relationship of producers, directors with the composer.
Yeah.
So how much freedom we have in terms of that because I had two experience of meeting directors in a session 2 weeks ago in university.
Yeah.
And both groups told me they didn't know much about film music, but they knew they wanted an orchestra. They want an orchestra to play it. And I said, well, what about you could include this in different scenes or everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, one of the films that they are recording, especially, is on a church. So she asked me, could you compose for church music? And I said, that's very broad. We can do, is it a Baroque church? Is it a Christian church? What kind of church it is? And how much freedom we have in terms of, because one group was not very happy, didn't look very happy when I said, oh, maybe you could also choose different kind of instrumentation, while other group was completely open about it. And I was not sure how to argue with them.
Yeah, that is such a good question, particularly for those musicians who have studied their instrument and or composition for many years. We can take it for granted what we've learned, all these new things that can be a complete mystery to other people who haven't worked in the world of music. I'll tell you a funny story about that. I was working on one film, I shall not name it, but I was working on one film one year, and the director suddenly jumped up when they heard a section of music. They said, I really like that. What are you doing there? How do you do that? What is it? And I said, well, it's just some brass lines moving in octaves. And the director said to me, octaves, I want more octaves. So it doesn't always help to talk about musical things with directors and producers, which is why I say just talk about emotions. It's much more helpful. This is something an American composer called Bruce Broughton emphasized in the work that he'd done, and in his experiences, he echoed that. So when you're working with filmmakers, be expected to have to kind of go back to a time before you knew about music. And the only way to be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is to take off your own. And that can be a difficult thing to do sometimes. So talk about emotions. If they say they want an orchestra, this is a kind of hard thing to say, but no disrespect, but you need to be sure that they understand what they mean when they say orchestra. Because if they hear maybe a cafe ensemble of 6 or 7, a sextet or a septet playing, to them that might represent an orchestra. To you it might not. For some of us, an orchestra, a chamber orchestra, needs, according to my last reading of Blatter, needs at least 30 players or 20 to 30 players. The budgets for that would be quite high. Do use players if you possibly can, even if you're asked to do an electronic score. And if you've got enough money in the budget to get in 1 or 2 players, keep music live. Keep hiring those players who practice for 6 hours a day. They need the work. Share and share alike. What goes around comes around. So if you can, do. It also makes a huge difference to the organicism and the living qualities of your sound if you've got a real player playing in your recording. Another thing to answer your question, Anna, is about director and producer satisfaction. Generally, I've worked more with directors than with producers, but I remember hearing recently, if a director says to you, oh, I would like it for it to be like this, and you give them this, but you also offer them another option, which was your option for the way you wanted it, my advice would be you go with the director's way, even if you prefer your way. The reason is that the director is going to have to live with that for years afterwards. And whenever they hear that section, they will always remember, it could have been my way. You're better off going their way. Quite often you'll find actually that their way could be quite a good way. I've ended up doing things in film scores which originally I didn't want to do, but actually I've been quite pleased about later down the line. So it can be collaboration can be a learning experience.
I think we have time for one more question.
I've got a few more here. Incidentally, if we don't get time to answer all the questions that have come up, I will answer those with text afterwards. So all the questions will be answered. So in order, how do you start if you haven't composed for a film or video game before? How do you get the gig if you have no work to show? Great question. I've been there. I know exactly what you were talking about. Okay, this is a catch-22. To get the work, you need to have done the work, but to have done the work, you need to get the work. Now, like all catch-22s, they are overcome through compromise. Life is a compromise. So my advice is get yourself a student film to do. Go and find a filmmaker in a film school or in a university or college department where they're learning how to make film or edit video, for example, and offer them some music. You can put cards up on the notice board. That's what I used to do at local film schools. Or now that we have this thing called social media, you can put ads out there to offer your services as a young composer. I bet you're not as bad as that. And I bet you're eminently hireable. So offer your services, and instead of focusing on what you don't know, focus and sell what you do know. When we're young, everyone has to start somewhere, and we learn from experience. And when you're young, you're going to have less experience than somebody who's older. So don't worry about it. Just see it as an opportunity for gaining experience. So start with student films. If you're too scared to do that and you're worrying about making mistakes, then it's possible to download from the internet film stock, which is in the public domain that doesn't have music on, and you can try out that to cut your teeth on and get to be able to do that. We've got a few more minutes, so I'll answer the next question. If I haven't answered adequately, do post extensions to your questions, and I'm very happy to help. Next question is, which software would you most recommend for composing primarily ... Okay, now I'm not allowed, nor would I want to, start advocating one company's software over another company's software. All I will say is that the mainly used popular digital audio workstation softwares that are out there at the moment, and I did identify them in the middle of my slide presentation, so go back and look at that slide that showed middleware and look on the left-hand side. Those softwares are very good digital audio workstations, all of them. But you'll find that some softwares are geared more to working in certain ways than others. The one which I happen to use, I'm not going to recommend it above any other, but the one which I use, just because I started using it back in the, I'm going to show my age here, the 1980s, don't tell anyone, is Digital Performer, which works very well with picture, and that's an all singing, all dancing piece of software. Lots of people use Apple Logic Pro, for example, but do investigate the other digital audio workstations softwares that I showed earlier, because they are amazing tools for composers nowadays that go far beyond what notation programs can do, which notation programs do well for notating. So which software? Get yourself a digital audio workstation that's dependable. If you're not happy with it, there are trialwares out there so that you can try it out for maybe a week or up to 30 days, I think now, and see which one you feel most comfortable with. Next question, you talked about metadata earlier. I certainly did, yeah. When does that come in? Who did you meet from the games industry who got you your first job? Ah, hey, I love these questions. Okay. Yeah, metadata nowadays is really important for digital information. It's so easy to download files now that people were worried about being able to tag in a permanent way your sound files so that you can always identify who the copyright owner is, either the copyright in the work, which is the idea of the music, or the copyright in the recording, which usually belongs to the person who paid for the recording to be made. Yes, that comes as a surprise to many composers. So when does that come in? Metadata usually gets put in at the mastering session when your music is mastered. And sometimes there can be such a hurry to get the composer's music put into the video game that there isn't time to master the music. Generally, the initial mix that the composer has made can be enough. So usually the metadata gets put in at the mastering session, and your mastering engineer will be able to do that for you. Otherwise, what I have done, if you have a look at the help sheet that accompanies this presentation, there is a section in there on metadata. And there I have listed softwares which I have found particularly useful for you to insert your own metadata if you want to. Definitely in there needs to go the ISRC code and the barcode if you are including your music as part of what they call a product now, which can be a single track or a collection of tracks. It's a bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but go and read about metadata there. So I hope that answers that question. Who did you meet from the games industry who got you your first job? Okay, confession. Although I teach composition for animation and computer games, the work I've done, being as what I'm such an old person at the moment, the work that I've done so far is 9 feature film scores and 14 short film scores. So I've not written music for computer games, but I work with people who teach and who make computer games at the university where I work at. But I still think I can answer your question. Go out there and look at they're available on the internet, the British companies that are making computer games at the moment. It's a very fast growing industry. Go to the events that the people who work for those companies go to and go and network with them. The way to network is not to network. Don't necessarily give out your business card. I'm looking at the time here. Don't necessarily give out your business card. Spend more time listening than talking. So ask them, hey, I read you were making this game. Tell me about it. Apparently there's a new version coming out. What are you working on at the moment? And how will the music work? And what music worked before, and how did that go, and what kind of pieces do you like? Ask questions and really get genuinely interested, not as an artificial thing, but with sincerity. And that's a great way to network. So that's how I would get my first job in the industry, through talking, asking questions, getting personal connections. People, composers who have been very successful in the industry who I've talked to, talk about family. They say, it's my family now, talking about the producers and directors that they work with. And that's an interesting concept, that these are people who belong to your sphere. It's not just about doing the rounds. I'm a new composer and wondering whether to join PPL or PRS or both. The answer is join both. PPL deals with performance royalties and PRS deals with writers. Such as they will send out royalties for composers and for publishers of music. It's important to get very clear in your head the differences between these different kinds of copyright and who collects royalties on your behalf. So the answer is to join both. As far as I know, at the moment, joining PPL is free, but there is a small fee for joining PRS. If you are a UK-based composer, then definitely join PRS. Your own country will have its own collection society if you are from abroad. Hey, it's a pleasure, says one of the questioners there. Okay, so I think it's time now for us to wrap up. If you have any other questions, do post them or send in a message through the usual channels, and I'll help as well as I can. Or if you'd like to contact us, you can send messages for me or for Anna through my email address, f.evans@mdx.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.